So I know you have things to say about No Child Left Behind and the housing crash. And again, like, these are things that we could do entire episodes on. But for the sake of, brevity, take it away.
All right. So I'm going to do, some more of the Bush B-sides, I guess we'll call them. And it's been really hard tangling through the rat's nest of legacies from the Bush administration. But I do want to stress the point that Bush's attack on the social safety net was a continuation of Clinton-era austerity, which used bunk social science and spurious conclusions from social science data to justify slashing benefits in the name of encouraging personal responsibility. So it wasn't a huge deviation. Maybe the way the message was couched was slightly different. The focus on faith-based organizations was slightly different. But in terms of there being a culture war departure or a radical change between the Democrats and the Republicans, that's absolutely not the case. And the same was true with Bush's approach to education. And it's easy to see that in two key areas where he tried reforms. The first is sex education, and the second is accountability-based school testing that was written into law with the No Child Left Behind Act. With the former, he bolstered Clinton-era abstinence-only education policies that tied school funding to the use of these programs. Here's a clip of Bush's weekly radio address, forgot that he did those, from July 17th, 2004.
We know that random drug testing in schools is effective, and it allows us to identify kids who need help. In my most recent budget, I proposed spending an additional $23 million for school drug testing. And although teen birth rates have declined, about 3 million of our teenagers contract sexually transmitted diseases each year. So we've requested a doubling of federal funding for abstinence-only education programs. We have also requested $25 million for our Character Education Initiative. This program will encourage schools to develop curricula that promote good character and help children develop a sense of responsibility to their community. Today, I urge the Congress to act on all these important initiatives. When parents, schools, and government work together, we can counter the negative influences in today's culture and send the right messages to our children. As yesterday's report shows, we're making progress in changing the culture of America from one that said if it feels good, do it, and if you got a problem, blame somebody else, to a culture in which each of us understands we are responsible for the decisions we make.
So I think there's a couple gems in there, but the most important is that Bush is couching these changes as ways of encouraging a culture of personal responsibility. And he's using that to funnel private money or public money into private institutions, the same way that Jen mentioned he had done with faith-based organizations. And we'll see that more a little bit later. One other staggering problem with Bush's approach to sex education, drug testing kids, and all of those other things he mentioned is that, in fact, under Bush, STD rates for minors increased, which is no surprise when Bush fought expanding Medicaid and providing comprehensive sex education, two things that are proven to prevent unwanted pregnancy and the transmission of STDs. In fact, abstinence-only programs contained a staggering amount of outright lies, including saying that abortions caused an increased risk of developmental issues for subsequent pregnancies, that using condoms resulted in pregnancy 1 out of 7 times, with no statistical evidence attached to this, and this gem that women, quote, gauge their happiness and judge their success on their relationships, while men's happiness and success hinges on their accomplishments, which I suppose is a way of raising responsible kids who take their own lives under their control, but not for the women. The women just have to focus on their relationships. With No Child Left Behind, the Bush administration also cloaked its efforts to break the teachers' unions and deprofessionalize the job as an attempt to improve the lot of Black, brown, and impoverished kids and teach social responsibility. This meant directly tying school funding to test results, which took autonomy away from teachers and had disastrous results for their students.
I think that No Child Left Behind created a totally utopian, unrealistic expectation that by 2014, 100% of all children would be proficient, and that schools that were not able to meet an unrealistic goal would be punished. So it created a very punitive language around schooling that said that if you don't meet this utopian goal, your school will be closed, your teachers will be fired, everybody involved in the process is somehow tainted. And it has created a tremendous momentum for privatizing public education. So I think that all in all, we see, I think, a danger right to the heart of public education as something that we should be improving and not destroying.
No Child Left Behind's accountability system also relied on a school choice model where a faulty school could close and new, better schools would take its place. Families could leave failing schools and use vouchers to attend more successful places, usually in the form of private or charter schools. This created a direct transfer of public funds from public institutions into private schools or charter schools. And it created a two-tier system of unionized public school teachers and non-union private and charter school teachers. Like Jen said, there's a lot to get into, and we should do a show on the charter school privatization school choice model alone, which is rooted in America's white supremacist past. But it worked perfectly with Bush's faith-based approach, which saw him funneling public money for social welfare to faith-based nonprofits and funneling money for public schools to faith-based private schools or excellence-based charter schools. Bush's culture war was grease for the wheels of privatization, and that should not be forgotten. It wasn't just a simple bipartisan disagreement issue or cultural issue. It was a way of justifying austerity that would have horrifying ramifications for decades to come. But perhaps the most egregious moment of the Bush years, if we have to pick one that's not Hurricane Katrina or the Iraq War, was the housing crisis. Summarized here by former President Bush himself.
Well, most economists agree that the problems we are witnessing today developed over a long period of time. For more than a decade, a massive amount of money flowed into the United States from investors abroad because our country is an attractive and secure place to do business. This large influx of money to U.S. banks and financial institutions, along with low interest rates, made it easier for Americans to get credit. These developments allowed more families to borrow money for cars and homes and college tuition, some for the first time. They allowed more entrepreneurs to get loans to start new businesses and create jobs. Unfortunately, there were also some serious negative consequences, particularly in the housing market. Easy credit, combined with the faulty assumption that home values would continue to rise, led to excesses and bad decisions. Many mortgage lenders approved loans for borrowers without carefully examining their ability to pay. Many borrowers took out loans larger than they could afford.
What Bush does not say is that his administration played a key role in pushing for deregulation and lack of oversight that led to a financial free-for-all. Bush also neglected to mention that the housing bubble was fueled in part by consumers borrowing against their homes to cover routine costs or supplement their retirement funds. While workers' wages stagnated, pensions were eroded, and benefits were more difficult to get, the housing boom was a lifeline for many Americans, and predatory lenders took advantage. Bush's deregulation left the door wide open with little or no consequences for those driving the global economic collapse. In fact, one hallmark of his administration was the push for home ownership, with mortgage subsidies Bush championed in the early days of his administration and expanded throughout his tenure. A former Bush economic advisor and the first Jon Snow to know nothing had this to say, saying, quote, "The Bush administration took a lot of pride that home ownership had reached historic highs. But what we forgot in the process was that it had to be done in the context of people being able to afford their house. We now realize there was a high cost." But the Bush administration consistently pushed the blame onto consumers, bailing out bad assets and big banks while millions of people lost their homes and descended into poverty. Compassionate conservatism at its best. And we know what happened next.
When the housing bubble burst in 2007, home prices fell 21%, and roughly 3.1 million homes were foreclosed on in the United States. The stock market plummeted by over 50%, and by the end of 2009, 8.8 million Americans had lost their jobs. And the effects lingered. From 2009 to 2012, the incomes of the bottom 99% grew by only 0.4%. But the income of the top 1% grew by a staggering 31.4% in the same time span. And it all ties back to two things. First, the government disproportionately gave more aid to banks and corporations. In 2008, the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act was signed into law, creating a $700 billion program to purchase devalued assets from banks. This was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. Later, President Obama would direct $75 billion in funds from TARP to help reduce interest payments for homeowners. That means homeowners received around 10% of the direct relief that banks and corporations did.
So there you have it, personal responsibility. The people who created a crisis, got us into two wars that never seemed to end, committed dozens of financial crimes. They got off scot-free while we cleaned up the wreckage, hopefully while also marrying our partners. At least we got that.